The Reflection is a spooky ghost tale about two girls who go on a school trip to the countryside. A teenage girl named Rosemary attended a high school in a small city in Canada. One day, her biology teacher announced that he was taking the entire class on a school trip. Everyone was delighted. The next day, a bus brought all of the students to a remote part of the countryside. The purpose of the trip was, of course, educational. The teacher told them they were going to explore a nature trail. As they walked along the trail, Rosemary was enjoying the fresh air and the time off from school. She was chatting happily to her best friend, Amanda. The two girls were caught up in conversation and started lagging behind. Somewhere along the way they took a wrong turn and became separated from the rest of the group. The girls kept walking, hoping that they would eventually meet up with the rest of the class, but they just became more lost. Eventually, they came to a small pathway and were relieved when they saw that it led to a little cottage, set back amongst the trees. The walls were covered with ivy and the garden was overgrown. The doors and windows looked as if they hadn't been painted in decades. When they knocked on the door, a little old lady came out to greet them. She was very frail and stooped with age. They asked her if they could use her phone. The old woman invited them inside and offered them a cup of tea. The two girls were tired and accepted her offer without hesitation. Inside, the cottage was dirty and grimy. The floor was muddy and the fireplace was covered in soot. The old woman told them to sit down and, for some reason, as she hurried out to the kitchen, she said, "Keep your eyes shut." The girls wondered what she meant by that last comment. Curious, they looked around the room and their eyes settled on a large mirror that was standing in the corner. Somehow, they couldn't seem to take their eyes off the mirror and sat there, quietly staring at their own reflections. In the mirror, their faces appeared strange and distorted. It looked as if their cheeks were covered with scratches. They couldn't seem to tear their eyes away from the unsettling image. As they watched in horror, their faces began to change rapidly. More scratches appeared, followed by large bruises and bleeding wounds. The two girls had a very bad feeling about this. Just then, Amanda turned her head and Rosemary saw something that terrified her. In the reflection, she saw that Amanda had a sharp knife sticking out of her eye and her own face looked as if it had been crushed. They covered their eyes with their hands and started shaking and screaming. The old woman came hobbling back into the room and when she looked at the two girls, she growled, "I told you to keep your eyes closed." Without another word, Rosemary and Amanda jumped to their feet and ran out of the house. They kept running, crashing through bushes and jumping over streams, not knowing where they were going. Eventually, they saw the school bus in the distance and breathed a sigh of relief. Their classmates were surprised to see the two girls come running across the fields. The teacher got angry with them and told the girls they had kept everybody waiting for over an hour. Rosemary and Amanda were just glad to be back with their classmates again. The school trip was over, so all of the students climbed on board and the bus drove off. By the next day, the two girls had almost forgotten about their scary incident with the old woman in the little cottage. However, exactly 1 week later, Rosemary and Amanda were found dead in their beds. Their sheets were stained with blood and their bodies were covered in scratches, bruises, and deep wounds. The Farmhouse is a spooky tale about two young boys who go exploring in the countryside and come across an old, abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. Every summer, my mother would take me to visit our relatives who lived out in the country. My cousin and I were almost the same age and we were always up to mischief. We spent our days out in the fields, exploring the area, making bows and arrows, sharpening knives, throwing rocks, climbing trees and tracking wild animals. One day, we set out on a long walk across the fields, not really having any idea where we were going. Sometimes we liked to get ourselves lost and then try to find our way home. After a few hours of walking, it was getting late in the afternoon when we came across a farmhouse that looked as if it was abandoned. On the property, there was a small storage shed, so we jumped over the fence and decided to find out what was inside. We found that the doors were locked. There was a small keyhole, but we couldn't see through it because it was blocked by dust and thick spider webs. We walked towards the house and noticed that the front door was standing open, but there was no sign of life coming from within. The yard was overgrown with grass and weeds. The only sound we could hear was an old windmill nearby, rattling in the breeze. I went to the door of the house and shouted, "Hello," but there was no answer. It was then that the smell hit me. It was the stench of damp, mold and decay. I stepped inside. There were clothes and papers everywhere, and some cardboard boxes. There was also an old bed, some racks of moth-eaten clothes, a leather armchair. I took a few steps forward and the smell seemed to get worse. A feeling of intense uneasiness washed over me and I wanted to turn and run away. Just then, something caught my eye. At the foot of the bed, between some boxes, lay a head. It was covered in gray hair. There was an old man lying on his back, his face turned upwards and his eyes open. He was dead. I let out a horrified yell, then grabbed my cousin by the arm and we both ran as fast as we could. As we fled across the yard, we were passing the shed outside when the locked door suddenly crashed open and an old lady was standing there. Her hair was in disarray and when she smiled, her lips parted, revealing a row of rotten teeth. She was carrying a bloody knife in her hand. She made an attempt to grab me as we rushed past, but I managed to dodge her and kept running. I didn't dare to look back, I just ran as fast as I could. It was a few minutes later that I realized my cousin wasn't with me. I stopped in my tracks, breathing heavily and looked around. He was nowhere to be seen. My heart sank. I started running again, desperately trying to get back to my aunt and uncle's house as quickly as possible. Eventually, I saw the lights of their house in the distance. As soon as I reached home, I ran inside and called out to my mother. My relatives gathered around me as I started babbling and begged them to go find my cousin. My uncle got into his truck and brought me with him. Eventually, we found the old farmhouse, but my cousin wasn't there. Neither were the old man or the old woman. After searching for a while, my uncle called the police. A few days later, my cousin still had not been found. The farm was searched from top to bottom, but there was no trace of him and he remains missing to this day. It's one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in the region. I don't know what happened to my cousin that day, but I am glad it didn't happen to me. There was an old man named Billy who claimed that he was being followed around by a little black dog. He said it followed him wherever he went and wouldn't leave him alone. Billy could often be seen hollering and cursing and throwing rocks, trying to drive the dog away. All of the people in town thought he was crazy, because there was no dog there. Whenever somebody tried to tell Billy there wasn't any dog to see, he'd reply, "Maybe you don't see it, but I do. And I'm not any crazier than you are." As the story goes, the first time Billy saw the little black dog was on the day he killed Silas Burton. Back in those days, the town was full of robbers and bandits. Everyone carried a gun and people were always going around fighting each other or killing each other. Billy was a young man back then and he hated Silas Burton. They had been feuding for years. One day, Billy saw Silas come riding toward him. As soon as their eyes met, both men went for their guns. Billy managed to get to his first and fired off the first shot. He hit Silas Burton square in the shoulder, knocking him off his horse. The horse got a fright and ran off, leaving Silas Burton lying there in the dirt with a bloody arm and a broken back. His gun had fallen where he couldn't reach it and he was just a sitting duck. He lay there on the ground, writhing in pain and begging Billy not to kill him. Billy just looked down at him and spit in his face. Then, he leveled his gun and killed him in cold blood. Silas Burton's little black dog came running over and started licking the dead man's face. Then, it let out a pitiful whine and started barking and snarling at Billy. Still in a murderous rage, Billy killed the dog too and left both of the corpses lying there in the road. Back then, there was no law in the town, so there was no sheriff and no deputies to arrest Billy. After the murder, he just walked home, drank a few beers and went to bed. But all night long, he heard the little black dog whining outside his cabin. "I must be imagining things," Billy said to himself as he tossed and turned in bed. "That dog is dead. I know because I shot it myself." The next morning, when Billy woke up, he looked out the window and saw the dog staring back at him. It was waiting for him outside. From that moment on, not a day went by when he didn't see it. At night, the dog would be scratching on his door and barking to be let in. During the day, it would follow him around town. Billy kept finding black dog hairs everywhere. They were on his sofa, on the floor, in his bed, and sometimes he even found them in his food. The whole house stank of dog. "It ain't my imagination," Billy said. "That's C. Burton's little black dog." Things went on like that for many years. Then one morning, in the middle of winter, the neighbors didn't see any smoke coming out of Billy's chimney. When they went to his house to check up on him, Billy wasn't there. A few days later, they found his body lying in a field behind his cabin. Billy had plenty of enemies, and at first it seemed like somebody might have killed him, but there wasn't a mark on him. He was lying in the snow and there weren't any footprints out there, except for Billy's. The doctor couldn't find anything wrong with the body and he couldn't figure out the cause of death. He said that Billy might have died of old age, or a heart attack, or the cold. But nobody believed that. There was something odd about his death. When the neighbors found Billy, there were black dog hairs on his clothes. There were even a few on his face. It smelled like a dog had been out there. Yet no one had seen a dog anywhere.